All right. So last week, not last week, week before last, we nearly finished the last of the questions from chapter 7 on our notes. The second to last, or the last question was the number 7 appears once again in chapter 7, where? Verse 12. Yep, chapter 7, verse 12. The attributes of God, once again, there's 7 attributes listed there. Blessing and glory and so forth. So there's multiple times throughout the last several chapters we've seen the praise of Jehovah and the praise of the Lamb and the different characteristics, and there's 7 of those characteristics, and that's specific. There's a reason for that, showing that complete and absolute nature of God. So that we're done with chapter 7, and as we, of course, we noted with chapter 7, the importance of the aspects of the fulfillment of the things of the scroll, and then, of course, dealing with the 144,000 and the importance of keeping that in context, making sure we understand the order in which things are being shown there, that the 144,000 are those who are on the earth at any given time, going through current distress and persecution. Those are God's people, those who are faithful to the Lord, not just specific to Israel, but spiritual Israel is what's being emphasized there. And then after that persecution and that great trial and so forth, you have this multitude in heaven. And I don't know if we covered the second to last question. I forget if we did or not. But the second to last question was that, as far as we know, no human soul is in heaven right now, because when we die, we go to a waiting place, the Hadean realm, which is divided into torment and paradise. So why do we have a multitude in heaven praising Jehovah there in chapter 7? Well, sure, there's created beings, but we have a multitude from all nations and stuff there in chapter 7.
Time marker says after this.
After this great tribulation, this great trial, certainly persecution being referenced there, but ultimately all of everybody's life as a Christian, all who desire to live godly will suffer persecution. And therefore, after this is looking forward and ahead to when there are souls in heaven, all the saved who get to go to heaven, or all the saved will get to go to heaven. And that's what's being referenced regarding that great multitude. All right. So remember, we had the first 6 seals of the 7 seals. The Lamb took the scroll from the Father on the throne. The scroll had 7 seals on it, and with each seal, as each seal was released, remember the 4 horsemen that we talked about covered the first 4 seals, and we had a 5th seal dealing with prayers being offered, and then the 6th seal being the judgment and so forth on those who are persecuting the people of God. The 7th seal, remember there was chapter 7 kind of represented not really a gap, but kind of an explanation regarding leading up to the 7th seal. So here in chapter 8, starting with verse 1 of Revelation, we have the 7th seal. And the interesting thing about this is, remember that the horsemen and so forth, we talked about and looked at the fact that these are all the consequences, the results of the teaching of the gospel with that first horseman. The teaching of the gospel, the spread of the gospel, and how that it would conquer the hearts of those who were willing to hear and obey it. But then as a result of that would come great distress, would come great persecution. And then, of course, we discussed the saints and those who died for the Lord and so forth, and how that they were under the altar, and how that their prayers were coming up before Jehovah, or their cries were coming up before Jehovah. And it was that question, how much longer? How much longer will you continue to allow this to happen? And, of course, Jehovah tells them, or the answer to them is, you rest. God's going to take care of this. It'll happen when he's ready. But the end result is God is going to take vengeance. Well, here in chapter 7, of course, at the sixth seal, there is that recognition of vengeance. There's that recognition of judgment, of destruction of those who persecute the people of God. But then here in chapter 8, with the seventh seal, there's something a little bit different that happens. So you open the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. And another angel, having a golden censer, came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints ascended before God from the angel's hand. And then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it to the earth, and there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. Now, verses 1 through 5 signify the seventh seal. Okay, this is what the seventh seal, the very first thing we see is with the opening of the seventh seal. Remember, all the openings of the other seals, what did we see? With the other 6 seals, as soon as the seal was opened, did something happen? Yeah. John either heard something or he saw something. With the seventh seal, what happens? Silence for about half an hour. Now, I want you to contrast this with what we've seen from chapter 4 on. What is happening constantly in heaven? All the time. Praise, adoration, singing before the throne, singing new song before the throne, constantly, over and over and over and over. And now all of a sudden, verse 1, what is it? Silent. That really stands out compared to chapter 4, 5, and 6, and 7. But chapter 7 is not really looking at the throne. 4, 5, and 6, there's noise. There's stuff going on. And in here in verse 1, with the opening of the seventh seal, everything just stops. Everything is silent. Everything is still. Now, after half an hour, verse 2, there are trumpets given to 7 angels. Why the half an hour of silence? Huh? Okay. Awe and wonder, maybe? Go ahead.
Comment on the situation, we think about God hears our prayers. That's amazing with 8 billion people or whatever the numbers might be. But as you just said, in an environment where there's noise and praise and all this going on, not just around him, but to him, he's the center of it. But still, he's going to hear and aware what's going on and is going to respond.
Right.
Next few verses.
And it's interesting because you have, like we noted with the first 6 seals, something happened immediately. Okay, something took place immediately. And it's almost as if with the 7th seal, it's like there's this waiting, this anticipation. And as Nolan mentioned, as we're going to look at, there's this period of time, God is hearing the cries of his people. He's hearing the prayers that are being offered. And this period of silence almost signifies this period of time where God is contemplating, or not contemplating, but he's taking in all of these cries and all of these prayers, and he has in his plan established a time period that he's going to enact his response. That's what this half hour represents. It's anticipation from everybody else, but God has already planned. He's got this time established where there's going to be waiting. Okay, the cries of the people are still coming up during this time, but there's going to be a period of waiting. And then when God is ready, when it's according to his will, he will respond. And in a lot of ways, that kind of goes back to, it harkens back to that question that the saints who had been martyred for the cause of Christ, who were under the offering or the altar of the burnt offering, before the throne, their cries for when will you complete this? When will you bring vengeance? And it's almost an answer to that, when God is ready. Now, John doesn't offer us, and nobody offers us, God doesn't tell us when that time period ends. But he does tell us what's going to happen when that time period ends. Okay, what happens when he's ready? Well, first of all, with the sixth seal, we have the recognition of the judgment, or the bringing of the destruction upon those who troubled God's people. But then here, and again in verse 2, we have, and it's interesting to me that in verse 2 we have the 7 angels who stand before God to give them, are given 7 trumpets, and we don't talk about the trumpets again until verse 6. To me, it's interesting how we could have easily gone verse 1, then verse 3, and then put verse 2 at the end of verse 5, because then it would make sense then talking about the trumpets. But that's not how the Holy Spirit revealed this to John. It's almost as if God is already aware. He knows. Verse 3, 4, and 5, the prayers offered to God and so forth, God already knows. And so there's already preparation, verse 2, for what these 7 trumpets are going to do. God has already established this. And so then in verse 3, we'll talk about the 7 trumpets and the 7 angels in a minute. Verse 3, then another angel having a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense that he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. Now this is a different altar than the one we talked about in chapter 6 with regard to the martyred saints and the souls who were under the altar. That was the altar of burnt offering. This is the altar of incense. This would align to Exodus 30 and Hebrews chapter 9 regarding the golden altar on which incense was offered. It was outside the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle or in the temple. And so this altar, it's different. So we're not associating this altar with chapter 6. But here is this angel. Now some commentaries suggest that verse 3, this is Jesus. And yet, at no time in Revelation is Jesus ever referred to as an angel. Okay, Jesus is not a created being. In fact, that's one of the points that the Hebrew writer makes in Hebrews chapter 1 and chapter 2, that Jesus is far and above, far different and greater than the angels. But we have an angel. He stands at the altar. He's given much incense. And of course, incense is those spices that were burned on coals, and it represented this, sometimes we refer to the sweet-smelling savor or aroma that would be offered before Jehovah in the tabernacle, and it was associated with prayer. Okay, incense and prayer are kind of interconnected with one another. And as this individual, as this angel is offering it up, it says he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. Notice all the saints are being mentioned here. We're not just talking about martyred saints, we're talking about all the saints. And these are all the saints that are on earth too. Remember the ones in chapter 6, they have already died. Okay, they're in Hades. They're waiting, and yet they cry out. It's kind of a symbolic thing, crying out, when will this vengeance take place? Here we're talking about people who are still on the earth, faithful people of God, and they're offering up these prayers. Now, we're told in Romans chapter 8 that who is it that makes intercession for us? Jesus. Jesus makes intercession for us. And so what's being described here is this angel, he's not mediating for the saints on the earth. Okay, Jesus does that. He's simply serving just as the priests did in the tabernacle or the temple in offering up then that incense to Jehovah. These prayers are coming up before Jehovah, but Jesus is mediating for these saints. Okay, he is the one who is interceding in the prayers of these saints. And so this altar kind of represents the people of God, if you will. And the incense represents the prayers that are coming up before Jehovah. And so this concept of the much incense is the understanding that, remember, incense was something that it was meant to please the Lord. Okay? Well, prayers, what is something that is always connected with prayer, especially in the New Testament? We offer up our concerns, we offer up our worries, our cares, but what else is always connected with prayer? Thanksgiving. Always. And the concept of thanksgiving, the concept of recognizing the blessing of Jehovah, these prayers are arising constantly to Jehovah. And again, also with the issues that are taking place. And that's kind of the focus, is the persecution that the saints are enduring. And so verse 3 kind of recognizes these prayers coming up. Thoughts or comments through that?
Does anybody else find assurance and encouragement in all the forces that are at work on our behalf? We talk a lot of times about our great foe Satan, and he's real and scary and all that, but as you reference Hebrews 1, the angels are ministering saints. We don't know all the ins and outs of what and how they do that, but they're working behind the scenes, working for us. And as this angel here, to take our prayers, we do the best we can, but sometimes I don't get the wording right, or, whatever, but presenting them, if you will, in a favorable sense with the sweet-smelling savor.
Right.
Just presenting them to God to make sure they're heard, or to his attention, we would say. Not that he's lacking, but I just find, as I said, assurance in a number of these passages about what angels are doing on our behalf.
Yeah.
That we don't know, can't see.
Right.
But John's telling us.
Well, and of course we're told, and the Hebrew writer tells us, that angels are ministering spirits. They're there to serve the people of God for their benefit, on their behalf. Now, how God utilizes them, either in heaven or on the earth, we don't know that. But just as Nolan said, all the inner workings that are taking place, and it all focuses on, and really this is what Revelation is all about, the love that God has for his people. That's what Revelation, the whole of Revelation is all about, that. The love that Jesus has, the Father has, the Holy Spirit has for his people. This is why Jesus writes to the 7 churches. With one of them he even says, those whom I love, I what? I rebuke, I chasten. Okay, those who I love, I rebuke, I chasten. Therefore, be zealous and repent. I think it was Laodicea he said that to. And so it's the whole point of this is to show how that God's entire, he's focused his entire throne of creation towards man, and more specifically towards those who would be faithful to him. Okay, that is what the whole focus of the inner workings, all the mechanisms going on in heaven, they're focused on man and focused on the saved. And yeah, I think that's a hugely encouraging and motivating thought. Just as David considers, what is man that thou art mindful of him? It's not just that God is mindful. He's focused on us. Anything else through verse 3? Yes, sir.
One time in high school class, I said, you may not realize this, but your parents' life revolves around you.
Yeah.
And I remember Darcy again saying, oh, I like that. But what we've just said, it sounds just like what God is doing. His whole being is surrounded us.
Yeah.
And that's his whole purpose in life, is us. Our purpose in our life
Yeah.
is us. And that's the first thing that came to mind is, wow, how much he's doing, not for anybody else, but for us.
Yeah.
For mankind.
Yeah.
His church, his family, the body of Christ. And if we can take that in, that God's life revolves around us, it's true. So true.
Well, and to think about the fact that, if God is so focused and has arranged all these inner workings of heaven toward our benefit and toward our good, what's the least that we can do? Serve him, be committed to him, do those things that are pleasing to him. We're here this morning to study. We're here this morning to worship. That's part of what pleases him. He's got all of this arranged to focus on us. The least we could do is be focused on him and make sure that we're doing those things that are important for him. Verse 4, the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints ascended before God from the angel's hand. And then in verse 5, the angel takes the censer. Okay, now the censer is this bowl, and it has these hot coals, and upon these hot coals is placed these spices, this incense that then burns. He takes the censer, he fills it with fire from the altar, and throws it to the earth. And there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. Now, verse 5 kind of represents God's response to the prayers. Okay, the angel, when he takes the censer, the interesting symbolism here is that the censer's filled with, for all intents and purposes, the prayers of the saints. And what they're asking, what they're requesting, what their worries are, what their cares are, he takes fire from the altar and he throws it to the earth. It's like these hot coals, and all the representations of the prayers then filled with flames and thrown to the earth. Now, the earth here is being used to symbolize the realm of the unbelievers, the realm of the unsaved, and even more specific to that, the realm of those who are persecuting God's people. Okay, this is God's response. This is God receiving those prayers, receiving the cares and the worries and the, be mindful of their threats, Lord, and so forth, and God's response to that. Throwing fire, quote unquote, to the earth, to the realm of those who are causing the suffering. And then notice, remember back in chapter 4 when we saw the throne of God, and John is hearing and seeing things that are taking place that are coming from the throne. He says there were voices, and there were lightnings, and there were thunderings coming from the throne in Revelation 4. Well, what's added to that here? An earthquake. Yeah, I mean, he's hearing noises, he's hearing thunderings, he's seeing lightnings, but now there's an earthquake. And it's, what does an earthquake represent, especially when associated with God, and especially symbolism with that regard? What does an earthquake tend to represent?
That time of the earth opening up and swallowing disobedient folks.
Sure. Yeah. In fact, I think Gilbert's. No, that wasn't Gilbert's. When was it? It was fairly recently. We talked about the opening up of those who were complaining and murmuring against Moses and so forth, and the earth swallowed them whole. But the idea of God's going to shake something. Okay, you think about when Jesus died. Okay, there was darkness over the land. And what else happened? Earth shook. Okay? Think about the Mount Sinai. Okay? Part of the lightnings and the thunderings, one of the other things that was going on, the earth was shaking. All right? God, he shakes the earth when he is either angry or when he's making changes to something. And one of the key components here that we see is this judgment. In fact, in Isaiah 29, Joel chapter 3, earthquakes are associated with the judgment of God. Not literal earthquakes per se. Again, even the literal earthquake when Jesus died was symbolic. It did happen, but it was symbolic. There was a reason why it happened. It was meant to show forth information and knowledge. It's not like earthquakes happening today have some kind of association with Revelation. That's not the point. What John is revealing to us is that there was an earthquake. There's rebuke, there's judgment that is being thrown towards the earth now. And then we have the 7 trumpets, because the 7 trumpets are going to represent this increasingly serious, increasingly in scale and in degree, increasing judgment upon those who are causing trouble for his people. And that's why, verse 2, the 7 angels are given the 7 trumpets. Because God already knows, it's already set how he's going to handle things. These prayers coming up, God's already aware of them. That's why in verse 2, the angels have the 7 trumpets. And that's why we don't have it at the end of verse 5. Instead, have verse 2 as verse 6. that the 7 angels were then given 7 trumpets, and then we have the blowing of the trumpets. No. Even before the quote-unquote, the prayers ascend to heaven, God already has it in place. He's already prepared for what he's going to do. But there's a time period that has to be allowed within his plan. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen according to man's time frame. It's going to happen according to what he has established for his reasons. Reasons that are not ours to question. All right, so anything through verse 5? So going back then to verse 2, 7 angels. Again, are these special angels? No. Why are there 7 of them? It represents that completion, that fullness, that absoluteness. They're given 7 trumpets. Why 7? Fullness, completion, absolute. The idea of 7 is not to be meant to understood as being literal. Yeah, there's the concept of unity. Certainly, 7 is kind of the fullness of things, that refining aspect or unifying aspect of togetherness. And certainly, as he describes what's going to happen, there is the recognition that then is associated with the response to these prayers of the saints. And that goes back to that unity that God is seeing and hearing all the things that are happening as well. So here in verse 6, anything from verses 1 through 5? Okay. And I want to be clear about this too. Remember, we talked about with the 144,000 and those who are coming out of the tribulation, those who end up before the throne after the events of the Great Tribulation. This is coming out of not just the time period in which Rome is persecuting the saints. It's not just the specific time period in which John is being given this information. Okay, this is out of every time period. All of the faithful of God, from the beginning of time until when God ends it, all of these people are being represented as the 144,000 on the earth who are faithful to God and suffering through whatever persecution they're facing, whatever degree it may be. Okay, and even today, we have brethren, people who are faithful servants of God, suffering to varying degrees. Okay, here in America, we have it very good in comparison to people in other places, brethren in other places who are thrown in jail, who are beaten, who are killed because of their faith. And it's happening even today. Well, this is still representing the vengeance of God that is going to take place on those who trouble his people. Not just Rome. It didn't exclude Rome, and that's the specific application for John's time period. But what's going to happen, this noises, thunderings, and lightnings, remember how we talked about those voices and so forth, represented this activity coming from the throne of God. Okay, this is God. He's working. He is constantly working. Well, now we have an earthquake. Okay, this is judgment of God. It's coming. And again, this is certainly, especially for Rome, there was a physical sense because Rome certainly ended up crumbling and was destroyed. But there's also a spiritual sense of judgment as well. Let's do that. All right. So, verse 6. So the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. And then starting in verse 7, we have the first angel sounding the first trumpet. Now, it's important to remember that trumpets there are times in which in the Old Testament trumpets are used as celebratory or joyous. But usually trumpets are a symbol of warning or instruction. We see like in Numbers chapter 10, Ezekiel 33 with the watchman. Trumpets generally were a sound of there's an enemy approaching or there's something happening, there's something imminent about to take place. And that's what trumpets here are meant to represent. It's a way to represent there's something imminent coming. There's something bad on the way. We think about, our storm systems and the sirens we have in Wichita Falls and Iowa Park. The sirens they run, we test them every Monday at noon or so. But they're meant to be there for when there's something imminent, a tornado or something is coming, and you need to know to take shelter. Well, this is virtually the same concept. Okay, these trumpets sounding represent that same imminent danger that is coming upon these people who are troubling God, or who are going to come upon these people who are troubling God's people. So it's important also to remember that the events that are associated with the sounding of these trumpets, they're not meant to be taken as a literal culmination of this event's going to happen, and this event's going to happen, and this event. Okay, like as in to look at it from the perspective of trying to align, there was a raid on the city of Rome, and that represents the first trumpet. Then there was a war. Rome went to war with this people. That was the second trumpet. That's not what it was meant to represent. Okay, these aren't meant to represent actual literal events that takes place in history, or for that matter, for us in our modern lives. They're symbolic of understanding that there's going to be a period in which God, there's certainly long-suffering here, in the sense that not everybody's going to be destroyed, not everybody's going to be killed all at once and so forth, but there is a sense of escalation here leading to a final, ultimate, decisive point. And that's kind of how these trumpets are going to go forward. Thoughts or comments to that? All right. So it also is interesting. In fact, I meant to have, I wonder if I saved that. Maybe I may not have. Anyway, we have 3 sevens within the last couple of chapters. Okay, we've got the 7 seals from the scroll. We have 7 trumpets, but then also with the 7th trumpet is going to be the opening or the pouring out of 7 bowls. All right, so we've got 3, and of course 3 has its own symbolism. But the recognition of these kind of series of 7s, so to speak. And in a lot of ways, the seals that we talked about, these 7 seals, kind of represents the fullness of everything. Okay, that represents this fullness of everything leading up to and including Judgment Day, and then the saints then being in heaven. But with this 7th seal, this kind of goes back to now, going back to, because remember at the end of with the 144,000, and then after these things we see the multitude in heaven. Well, going back to these seals, with this 7th seal now, these trumpets are going to sound. God's focusing on the judgment that's being poured out on those who are evil and persecuting his people. But what's interesting is the 7 trumpets, they're going to parallel the 7 bowls. Okay, same concept, but being said in different ways, to show that pouring out of God's wrath, of God's anger, to show that he's warning people. Okay, this is what's going to happen. And this warning isn't just for, I mean, obviously, people of God who are being faithful, they don't need to be warned. The gospel has warned them. But in many ways, these trumpets are meant as a warning sound. You need to recognize the error of your ways. You need to recognize what it is you're doing. You have an opportunity to change. But that opportunity is not going to last forever, is it? I mean, at some point, does the opportunity for repentance run out? Yeah. You know, at some point, opportunity for repentance, there's no more time. And that time is either when I've died or when the Lord returns, and we don't know when either one's going to happen. Okay, I mean, just like for Esau, though he sought it diligently with tears, did his time run out? Yeah. Once it was done, he couldn't take it back because it was done. And so this is part of this warning that God is issuing to all people. It's also interesting. I put a quote on our notes. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But I thought this was a really interesting quote, and it's from Bob Harkwriter's commentary on the book of Revelation. It's at the end of the first page and going into the top of the back of the first page. He says, we see a series of 3 sevens, talks about the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls of wrath. Then he says, this becomes most apparent when comparing the 7 trumpets with the 7 bowls of wrath, because the objects affected are the same, only they suffer increased intensity of God's judgments. The information revealed in the 7 seals is more general in nature, as the first 6 seals give a panorama of God's dealings with mankind on earth, beginning with the coming of Christ, that's the first horseman and the spread of the gospel, culminating in the scene of final judgment. The 7th seal, and this is where we're at right now, opens the 2nd series, the 7 trumpets. And then chapter 10, we have with the 7th trumpet, there's the bowls of wrath then being poured out. All 3 series of 7s are simultaneous, although the trumpets and the bowls of wrath are more limited in time as they deal only with things which must shortly come to pass. I thought that was a really good point to make, that because we see the full scale of everything with the 7 seals. But then with the trumpets and with the bowls of wrath, this is more specific to things which must shortly come to pass. Those are things that are specific to John. And certainly there is a application to all those who are evil, those who persecute God's people, but especially as it applies to Rome and those who were persecuting God's people at the time of John. He goes on to say, from the background of heaven, John describes them one after the other by revealing from different viewpoints the judging and restraining action of God. And I thought that was an interesting point too, because what we're going to see is there's a series of 1/3. Okay, a third of people die, a third of the grass, or a third of the this is destroyed, a third of that is destroyed. And it's always a third for these 7 trumpets, or for these first 6 trumpets. And is it that God couldn't destroy all of it? Does God not have the power to destroy 3/3? Okay, he could destroy everything if he wanted. But there's a restraining element about Jehovah. Because think about, you remember when the children of Israel, when they were sinning with the, remember the plague that God sent after the children of Israel sinned with the golden calf? Did he destroy all the people? Now he threatened to, remember? They were all wicked, but yeah, he destroyed a portion of the people who, as they were involved in the sin, but he could have destroyed them all. Okay, and over again, we see that with Israel and how that there are times where they're involved in something they shouldn't be. God punishes them, but there's a restraining aspect to it. He doesn't destroy all of them all at once. Okay, even with the taking away into captivity. Okay, he doesn't destroy them all. Well, there's always a remnant, and especially that remnant of those who are going to do what's right and who are faithful. Yeah, and he is going to do it if you don't listen, right? He threatened to take them away into captivity if they didn't listen, and what happened? They didn't listen, so he took them away to captivity. But there were always people who were going to remain faithful to Jehovah. He always took care of them. He always preserved them. So here in verse 7, the first angel sounded, and we see hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown to the earth, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. Again, this is not meant to be literal as some great forest fire taking place over all the earth, or a third of the earth, or something like that. It's meant to describe destruction. That being the case, notice hail and fire mingled with blood. Okay, some of these are going to sound very similar to what else happens in Egypt. The plagues. Yeah, there's very similar parallels with some of the things that are being done, and I think there's a deliberate reason for that. What were the 10 plagues meant to represent? Not only to the Hebrew people, but to the Egyptian people. Power of God. Power of Jehovah. Okay. Now the Hebrew people, they were supposed to have already been convinced by the signs that Moses and Aaron did. Remember, God equipped Moses and Aaron with specific signs and say, I am sent me. But to Egypt, remember, we have these 10 plagues. And every time Pharaoh says, no, I'm not letting the people go, there's another plague. And with the 10 plagues, what else do we see? It kind of escalates, doesn't it? It gets worse. gradually gets worse and worse and worse.
More of his power each time.
Yeah, showing that complete domination that Jehovah clearly could have, but he's restraining himself. And just like with the Egyptian plagues that were meant as a sign for Egypt, for the wicked, especially for Pharaoh, to show you have no idea who you're messing with. You have no idea who you're defying. Okay? He has complete power. This is the same thought process.
It's kind of like that thing where it's like, there always could be something worse.
Yeah.
And that's what he was doing in a way.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, yeah. And it did get worse. I mean, even to the firstborn of every male child in Egypt, every male of the livestock, firstborn male of the livestock, the concept of that escalation that finally then convinced Pharaoh to let God's people go. Well, the same purpose is behind these 7 trumpets. The same purpose of kind of pushing them to see what they're fighting. You are fighting against Jehovah, the creator of all things. You're not just persecuting human beings, you're persecuting the church that belongs to Christ. Christ is the Son of God. Okay, so you need to think about what it is you're doing and what enemy you're making here.
And also said he wasn't going to back down.
No.
He back down because of the words he did.
Yeah, Jehovah doesn't back down to man. No. And so this verse 7, the hail and fire, okay, that's pretty bad. But notice it's mingled with blood. Now, why do you think the hail and fire is mingled with blood? Again, what's our specific context of judgment? Those who are doing what to God's people? Persecuting. And in some cases, killing, okay? We know Antipas, faithful martyr that Jesus referred to, he was killed, and he wasn't the only one. And so this almost seems to represent not the blood of faithful saints that have died necessarily, but the blood, it's as if, the phrase how we brought this on our own head, so to speak. Remember how the Jews, how that they cried out at the trial of Jesus before Pilate, let his blood be on our heads and on our children's and our grandchildren's. Okay, it's like they brought this on themselves. It's their own blood. Okay, it's their own blood. Now, some commentaries suggest it's the blood of the saints as if it's righteous vengeance on those who persecuted the people. But I tend to think that this is your blood, because they're the ones that are suffering. God's bringing suffering on you now because you cause harm and bloodshed for his people. God's bringing your own blood on your own head because you did this to yourself. All right. We'll stop there. We'll pick up here with the 7 trumpets, and Lord willing, finish chapter 8 next week. Thank you, everybody.